regions which I want you to know. The anterior and posterior pituitary, and they look distinctly different. I want you to be able to recognize them, one from the other, and also know the hormones associated with the pituitary in these two different regions, two major regions. Okay, the first region we're going to talk about is the posterior region, also called the posterior lobe, and you can see it right here. Now, the posterior pituitary is actually mostly nervous tissue. You may remember the pituitary is attached to the hypothalamus, the brain, part of the diencephalon, by a thin stalk of tissue called the infundibula. You dissected the brain in A&P1, which I'm sure you did. You had to take off the dura mater, remember, the tough membrane that surrounds it? And in doing so, you probably ripped the pituitary right off, not knowing that it was there. What this is, though, this is called the neural hypophysis. That's another name for the posterior pituitary because it's mostly nervous tissue. Hypophysis, another name for pituitary, because it's mostly nervous tissue, it's called the neural hypophysis. What you see here are a lot of cells. For the most part, they are glial cells. These are nuclei glial cells. And you may remember when you're studying the nervous system, we've got the neurons, which generate and conduct nerve impulses. But actually, most of the nervous system consists of cells that are called glial cells, or neuroglia. Remember? 6 different kinds, okay? Right here. 4 of which are confined to the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then 2 lie outside central nervous system. By now you're experts on that, but the cells here have a fancy name. They're called pituocytes. They're glial cells in the posterior pituitary. And that's mostly what you see here. What's also present, but you don't really see them, are the axons of neurons extending down from the hypothalamus. Remember, if you remember a neuron, it consists of 1 or more dendrites, which bring the impulse to the cell body, and that's of course where the nucleus would be, and then 1 axon extending from the cell body. What you have here are the axons of hypothalamic neurons that extend down here, and that's actually what produce the hormones associated with the posterior pituitary. They're stored here and released, but they're actually produced by neurons of the hypothalamus. We got 2 prominent hormones. One we've already been talking about. Okay? So if you look just back to the first page, drop down toward the bottom where it says posterior pituitary. Everybody see that? Neural hypophysis. Okay? It says synthesized by neurons of the hypothalamus but stored and released from posterior pituitary. Okay? Now it's not the glial cells that produce, not the pituocytes, but it's axons of the hypothalamic neurons that produce these hormones. And there are 2 major ones, which I want you to know. Anti-diuretic hormone, we've talked about that, ADH for short. And that's exactly what it does, it's anti-diuretic. What's a diuretic? We talked about that in relation to the urinary system. What's a diuretic? When you're out on a night on the town, you're usually drinking a diuretic. Okay, an alcoholic beverage or a caffeinated beverage. Something that promotes urine formation. So anti-diuretic hormone inhibits urine formation. Again, it's produced by neurons of the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and released in the blood as needed. You can see what it does. It stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb more water and thus reduce urine production. Anti-diuretic. Okay? It also decreases sweat production, the sweat glands. It also is called vasopressin because it is a potent vasoconstrictor. Remember, most blood vessels have smooth muscle in the tunica media of the wall. When that muscle contracts, that's called vasoconstriction. It narrows the lumen or cavity through which the blood flows. What does that do to the blood pressure when you constrict the vessel? Elevates it. Okay, so vasoconstrictor brings up the blood pressure. That's exactly what this does. You have a massive blood loss, a hemorrhage, your pituitary dumps a lot of ADH into the blood, and what that does is cause vasoconstriction in the arterioles to bring up the blood pressure. You've got to maintain blood pressure to keep enough blood going to the brain, or you're going to shut down. And that's why it's also called vasopressin, because it's also a vasoconstrictor. So ADH, antidiuretic hormone, cause the kidneys to reabsorb more water, reduce urine production, and also it constricts blood vessels, causes vasoconstriction, especially in large quantities. So vasopressin, another name for the same hormone. All right, the other hormone you may have heard of as well. This is called oxytocin. Again, it's produced by neurons of the hypothalamus, released into the posterior pituitary, and then dumped into the blood as needed. Oxytocin stimulates smooth muscle contraction. So it's very important in labor and delivery. Stimulates uterine contractions, which of course are necessary to move the baby out of the body. It also stimulates milk release, or what we call milk letdown, by the mammary glands in the breasts. As you know, the breasts swell, especially late in pregnancy, because of course the mammary gland tissue is enlarging, and then usually shortly after birth, milk production begins. Oxytocin does not stimulate milk production, it stimulates the release of milk from those glands, what we call milk letdown, which usually occurs shortly after birth. So again, oxytocin, produced by neurons of the hypothalamus, starting the posterior pituitary, stimulates smooth muscle contractions, very important in labor and delivery, and also in letdown of milk. Not stimulation of milk production, but release of milk from the breast. Any questions? All right, the other major part of the pituitary is the anterior pituitary, which we see here. This is called the adenohypophysis. Again, hypophysis, another name for pituitary. This is glandular. And the hormones released here are actually produced by cells in the anterior pituitary, not in the brain. We got two general categories of cells, eosinophil cells and basophil cells. These are not blood cells, so don't call them basophils. They're basophil cells, probably because they somewhat resemble a basophil. And you've seen, hopefully you've seen some basophils, what do they look like? They're very dark, they've got those dark granules, look much like the nucleus of the cell is very dark by comparison. So again, we got two general categories of cells here in the anterior pituitary. The lighter stained cells, of the kind of pinkish in color, are the eosinophil cells. And the darker stained cells, which look like that dark purple here, are basophil cells. And again, I don't say basophil, say basophil cell. Okay, here we can see a little better, hopefully. Okay, these, they're kind of pinkish, actually really more kind of red-violet, but if you look at them on the scope, they look more pink. These are eosinophil cells. Not the nucleus, they're all purple, but the cytoplasm. Eosinophil cells, you can see from your handout again. Go to the top of the first page of your hormone handout, where it says anterior pituitary, adenohypophysis, another name for anterior pituitary. All right, the major hormones produced, there are two major ones produced by eosinophil cells. One's right at the top of the page, growth hormone, from the eosinophil cells. As it suggests, growth hormone has to do with growth, but indirectly. It stimulates what are called insulin-like growth factors, IGFs. And this would actually directly stimulates, okay, growth, body cell growth, protein synthesis, tissue repair. And these insulin-like growth factors are released by various tissues in the body, and you can see I've listed them there. Muscle, for example, liver, bone, and so on. under the influence of growth hormone. So growth hormone acts indirectly to stimulate growth.